You wake to the sound of steel being sharpened in the dim hours before dawn. Inside the Tower of London, May 19, 1536, the rasp of wet stone dragged against metal slices through the fog like a funeral bell, each stroke steady, unhurried, inevitable. You are a queen no longer, and in less than 4 hours that blade will separate your head from your body. The walls of your chamber seem to throb with your pulse. As you sit rigid on the edge of the narrow bed, your hands tremble, not from the chill of the stone, but from the crushing knowledge of what lies ahead. Beyond the barred window, the sound of hammers drifts upward. Carpenters work without pause, raising the scaffold that will be your final stage. Every thud of their mallets seems to strike your bones, each one a grim marker of time slipping away. Your ladies move about quietly, their faces pale, their eyes swollen from tears they dare not shed too loudly. They clothe you in a gown of muted gray satin, a white shift beneath it, colors chosen not by you, but by the king who cast you aside. Mourning and purity, repentance and surrender. Even here, at the end, Henry dictates how you will be seen. The air presses close and heavy, the stink of the river drifts in, mud and rot carried on the damp breeze. But another scent lingers too, sharp and strange, the iron tang of fear itself, mixed with incense burning in the chapel where priests pray for your soul. From outside your door comes the shuffle of boots, the rattle of armor as guards take their posts. The machine of death is awake and moving, and you are its center. This is where we step into the shadowed corners of history, into stories of survival, cruelty, and betrayal that time has not forgotten. If you find meaning in uncovering these darker truths, consider joining me on this journey. Your presence here, listening across centuries and distance, connects us in ways Anne herself could never have imagined. The road that led to this morning did not begin with treason, nor with adultery. It began with Henry's hunger, not for love, but for a son. It began with his restless gaze, drifting from his queen to the quiet figure of Jane Seymour. By January of 1536, Anne's position had already begun to crumble. She had lost yet another child, a blow made heavier by timing. That same day, Henry was thrown from his horse in a violent joust, left unconscious for 2 hours as the king lay near death and miscarried a son. The symbolism was cruelly clear to all who whispered at court. A kingdom trembling on the brink of chaos, a queen's hope slipping away for Henry. This was more than grief, it was proof that his marriage to Anne was cursed by God, just as he had once claimed his union with Catherine had been cursed. The same arguments he had used to cast aside his first wife now turned against the second. The irony was merciless. The very reasoning that had raised Anne to the throne would soon drag her to her death. But Henry could not rely on whispers of divine displeasure alone. To rid himself of Anne, he needed evidence. He needed charges that would leave no doubt, that would not stain his own image, that would silence pity before it could take root. And so his minister, Thomas Cromwell, began to weave a case, a net of accusations so tangled and so damning that when it closed around Anne, there would be no escape. Cromwell's first move was against a man who had always been close to Anne, Mark Smeaton, a gifted musician of humble birth, who played for the court and charmed those around him with a grace Henry himself could never possess. Young, dark-haired, and favored by the Queen's household, he was an easy target. On April 30, 1536, Smeaton was seized and taken to Cromwell's home in Stepney. There, behind closed doors, he was pressed until he broke. The records do not name the methods used, but what emerged was a confession, not just whispers of impropriety, but vivid details that would anchor the case against Anne. Words wrung from a man desperate to end his suffering, willing to trade truth for survival. With that confession, Cromwell tightened the snare. On May 1st, Henry Norris was taken. Norris was no court minstrel. He was the king's closest companion, his groom of the stool, the man trusted with Henry's most private moments. He had risen with Henry for over a decade, bound by loyalty and privilege. His arrest during the May Day celebrations at Greenwich was as deliberate as it was symbolic. In the midst of merriment, the king's most trusted servant was dragged into disgrace, charged not only with adultery, but with treason itself, a betrayal so intimate it cut to the bone. Next came William Brereton, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, arrested on May 4th. His Welsh roots and modest beginnings had tied his fortunes to royal favor. Cromwell accused him not just of lying with the Queen, but of conspiring to murder the king. The charge was no accident. It painted Anne as a woman so corrupt, so power-hungry, she would kill to place her lover on the throne. On May 5th, Sir Francis Weston, barely 25 and newly married, was seized, wealthy, secure, and with no need to gamble his life for Anne's attention. His alleged role baffled even those who despised her. Why risk everything when he had so much to lose? His inclusion revealed the truth of Cromwell's strategy. This was not a case built on reason. It was a performance, a cast of names meant to drown in beneath their weight. Then came the blow that silenced all sympathy. George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, Anne's brother, her confidant, her ally. On May 2nd he was accused of treason against the crown. The charge was monstrous, almost unthinkable, but that was its purpose. With it, Anne was no longer just a faithless wife. She was a creature beyond redemption, a woman whose depravity demanded the ultimate punishment. George, like Anne, was brilliant, witty, and dangerous in a court where words could be weapons. His loyalty to his sister made him a threat Henry could not allow. By branding him with charges of treason, Cromwell ensured no one could defend her without risking their own ruin. Within 5 days, the net had closed. Arrests came swift and merciless, leaving Anne's allies stunned, unable to act. This was not discovery. This was demolition. A carefully staged collapse designed to leave no cracks for hope. Anne herself was seized on May 2nd. She had just returned from watching a tennis match, where Henry had played alongside Francis Weston, the very man who, days later, would be named her lover. The cruelty was deliberate. Her last hours of freedom were spent in the presence of the same figure, whose arrest would help destroy her. It was her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who read the charges aloud. Norfolk, who had risen on the tide of the Boleyn family's fortunes, now stood to profit from their fall. Family ties meant nothing in the brutal arithmetic of Tudor politics. To survive, one cut away the condemned. Anne's response was disbelief. At first she laughed at the absurdity. Multiple affairs, secret meetings, when every step she took was watched, every word weighed. Yet her laughter subsided into silence as the gravity of the charges emerged: treason, conspiracy, and betrayal of the king. Each accusation heavier than the last, stacked not for proof, but for impact. This was not the fall of a woman, it was the unmaking of a queen. The barge that carried her to the Tower retraced the same path she had taken only 3 years before, when she rode in triumph to her coronation. Then, the crowds had cheered, showering her with petals. Now, they stood in silence, watching her pass with guarded eyes. In the very apartments where she had once prepared for her crown, she now waited for death. Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, was tasked with recording her every word. His notes show a woman swinging between defiance and despair, at times regal and composed, insisting on her innocence, at others overcome by terror. Yet always, somewhere beneath it all, she clung to one fragile hope: that Henry would spare her, that the man who had torn a kingdom apart to have her would not, in the end, destroy her. The arrests were swift, but the trials were theater. They were not about justice, they were about spectacle. Each man, one by one, was paraded before the peers of the realm, their fates already sealed, confessions forced, evidence twisted, rumors elevated to fact. What mattered was not proof, but performance. On May 12th, 3 were brought to trial at Westminster Hall: Mark Smeaton, Henry Norris, and William Brereton, all charged with adultery, all facing the death reserved for traitors. Smeaton, broken by interrogation, confessed. Whether through torture, promises, or fear, his words gave Cromwell the anchor he needed. Norris and Brereton, both men of rank and standing, refused to bend. They proclaimed their innocence, but their words fell against stone. In a court arranged by the king's will, innocence was meaningless. All were condemned. Francis Weston's trial followed, alongside George Boleyn. Weston, barely into manhood, faced his judges with a composure beyond his years. He denied the charges, but denial meant nothing. His guilt had already been decided. He was guilty not of crime, but of proximity, too close to a doomed queen. George Boleyn's trial was of an altogether different nature. The allegation of sexual misconduct within the family being not merely scandalous, but profoundly grotesque, so monstrous, that the court gasped at the words themselves. To even speak of it was to stain the air. Yet Cromwell pressed forward, wielding the accusation like a weapon meant to cut through reason. George defended himself with wit and eloquence, answering each point with skill that unsettled the prosecution. He reminded the court of the absurdity of the charges, the lack of evidence, the impossibility of such secret meetings in a palace crawling with servants and spies. His arguments were sharp, his voice steady, but his brilliance could not shield him. The more convincing his defense, the greater the threat he posed. Cromwell's machinery demanded silence, and so the verdict was written before the trial began: guilty. When George was told of his sentence, he delivered his final blow against the farce. Before the gathered peers, He read aloud a question allegedly asked by the king himself, whether Henry was capable of fathering children. It was a direct strike at Henry's pride, the one wound no monarch could endure. The court was shaken, the king humiliated. Whatever sympathy George might have inspired was buried beneath the fury of that insult. His fate, and Anne's with it, was sealed beyond doubt. The men were condemned to die at Tyburn, their bodies to be hacked and quartered as traitors, a death of shame, public and brutal, designed to erase not only life, but dignity. Anne's trial was held apart, on May 15th, within the great hall of the Tower itself. The setting was chosen with care. Here, inside these walls, there could be no distraction, no chance for voices from the crowd to murmur dissent, only silence and the weight of authority. She faced a panel of 26 peers, presided over by her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, a man whose ambition outweighed family, whose loyalty bent wherever the crown demanded, and stood accused of adultery, incest, and treason, crimes punishable not just by death, but by eternal disgrace. The charges were read, each one more elaborate than the last. Secret meetings, whispered exchanges, conspiracies woven in shadows. They named dates on which Anne was said to have betrayed her king, dates when she was proven to be elsewhere, even recovering from childbirth. The evidence was not only thin, it was impossible. But that was irrelevant. The trial was not a search for truth. It was a script, and every actor knew their role, and listened in silence, her face pale but unbroken. When at last she spoke, her words carried the clarity of a woman who understood the weight of history. She denied each charge, not with shrill protest, but with calm precision. She appealed not only to her judges, but to the generations yet to come, who would weigh her name long after the court had turned to dust. "I do not say I have been without fault," she admitted, "but never have I trespassed against the king in this way." It was not a plea for mercy. It was a statement of defiance, a final stand in a trial where victory was impossible. The verdict was a foregone conclusion, guilty on all counts. The sentence, to be either burned at the stake or beheaded, at the king's pleasure. The choice left to Henry was no mercy, it was spectacle. To burn her would be to mark her as a heretic, her death slow and horrific. To behead her was cleaner, quicker, though no less final. The court awaited his word, and was led back to her chamber in the Tower, her composure intact. Yet the walls closed in. Every sound from outside, every hammer, every whisper, every creak of wood, reminded her of the scaffold being raised. Time, once her ally, now marched only toward silence. The verdict left no room for doubt, but the final cruelty belonged to Henry. It was his decision whether Anne would burn or be beheaded. He chose the sword, not out of mercy, but calculation. Burning would have shocked Europe, staining his image beyond repair. A sword, sharp and swift, carried the air of dignity, of controlled justice, and so he summoned a headsman from Calais, famed for his skill. The message was clear, even in her death, Anne's fate would serve Henry's reputation. In the Tower, Anne prepared for the end with a calm that unsettled even her guards. Sir William Kingston recorded her words with the precision of a man both dutiful and shaken. At times she spoke with serenity, declaring she was ready to meet her God. At others, her fear bled through, sudden bursts of weeping, questions about the pain she might feel, desperate hopes for Henry's pardon. Her final days were spent in prayer and in reflection. She confessed not to guilt, but to her failings as a wife, her sharp tongue, her pride, her inability to bend. She knew her enemies would call it arrogance, but in truth, it was survival. In a court where silence meant invisibility, Anne had chosen voice. Now that voice was to be silenced. The men accused alongside her were executed first. On May 17th at Tower Hill, George Boleyn died with words of faith on his lips, but also with the bitter irony of a man condemned for crimes he never committed. His head fell, and with it, the last shield between Anne and her fate. She was forced to hear of their deaths from within the Tower. Her brother, her friends, all swept away before her. That same day, her marriage to Henry was annulled. The union for which a kingdom had been torn apart was declared invalid, as if it had never existed. By law, she had never been queen. By decree, her daughter Elizabeth was branded a bastard. The erasure was complete even before the sword touched her neck, and was scheduled to die on May 18th. She prepared herself, dressed for the scaffold, and made peace in prayer. But the hour passed, and no summons came. Instead, the execution was delayed by a day. Whether through disorganization or design, it was a calculated cruelty to ready oneself for death, only to be forced to wait through another endless night. It was torment by hesitation, and bore it with composure. Though Kingston noted her distress, she laughed at moments, sharp and hollow, her mind fraying at the edges of endurance. On the morning of May 19th, the day of execution, and dressed with care, she chose a gown of deep gray damask, lined with fur, with a crimson kirtle beneath, colors of dignity, chastity, and sacrifice. Over her hair she placed a gable hood, framing her pale face like the portrait of a saint. She would not go to her death as a criminal, but as a queen. The chapel bell tolled as the door opened. The guard stepped forward. The final walk had begun. The morning air was cool as Anne was led from her chamber to the scaffold erected. Within the Tower grounds, the place was chosen with care, not Tower Hill, where the crowds could swell beyond control, but a smaller space inside the walls, intimate, contained, where every word she spoke would be heard and remembered. Around the platform, a ring of guards stood rigid, their presence a silent warning against any show of sympathy. Spectators gathered in silence, courtiers, servants, and those summoned by duty rather than desire. Few came willingly, for to watch the death of a queen was not entertainment, but obligation. The weight of the moment pressed on all. Only 3 years earlier, these same stones had echoed with triumph as Anne was crowned. Now, they would drink her blood, and mounted the scaffold with steady steps. Her composure startled those who expected tears. Instead, she stood tall, her hood shadowing her face, her hands clasped before her. When she spoke, her voice was clear, calm, almost serene. She offered no protest, no accusation, no cry of betrayal. Instead, she chose words of humility and obedience, a final act of strategy. Good Christian people, she began, I am come hither to die. According to law, she admitted no guilt, yet she did not deny the charges. To do so would have been treason in itself. Instead, she praised the king, calling him a gentle and sovereign lord. Her words were not for Henry's ears, but for history's. She would not be remembered as defiant, but as dignified. Her composure unsettled the crowd. They had come expecting a broken woman, raging or weeping. Instead, they saw a queen who, even in death, would not bow, and knelt upon the straw, her body graceful, her hands folded in prayer. Unlike other condemned, she had no block to rest upon. The French executioner from Calais was famed for his swiftness, striking with a sword rather than an axe to spare her fear. He moved with practiced deceit, calling for his assistant to hand him the weapon. He distracted her gaze. In that moment, as her eyes turned aside, he raised the blade. With one swift stroke, it was done. No struggle, no scream, only silence. The queen who had once commanded kings, who had been the axis of a nation's upheaval, was reduced to stillness upon the scaffold. Her body was placed in an arrow chest, a rough box, too small for royalty, and buried within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. No procession, no monument, only hurried earth over wood. For Henry, the end was not mourning but renewal. Even as Anne's body cooled, his court prepared for celebration. Within days, he was betrothed to Jane Seymour, the quiet lady-in-waiting who had waited in Anne's shadow. The queen was gone, and with her, the storm she had brought. But silence does not erase memory. Anne's enemies sought to make her a warning, a ghost of ambition undone. Yet the daughter she left behind, Elizabeth, branded illegitimate, would rise to rule the very throne her mother had died for. In that, Anne's story did not end at the scaffold. It became the seed of a legacy that even Henry's fury could not erase. Anne Boleyn died not as a criminal, nor as a traitor, but as a queen, broken by politics, betrayed by power, yet unforgotten by history. Anne Boleyn's fall was more than the destruction of a queen. It was the unmasking of a system where power fed on itself, where ambition was both weapon and wound. Her enemies believed they had erased her, burying her name beneath shame and silence. Yet history is not so obedient. Cromwell, the architect of her downfall, would himself be consumed by the same machinery he once commanded. Barely 4 years later, he too mounted a scaffold, condemned for treason by the very king he had served so faithfully. The wheel of Henry's justice turned without loyalty, crushing all in its path. Henry, triumphant in the moment, did not escape the shadow of what he had done. His reign grew darker, more ruthless, his marriages a litany of suspicion and ruin. He gained a son, but not the peace he sought. The ghost of Anne lingered in whispers, in glances, in the face of her daughter. For Elizabeth, the child once branded a bastard, her mother's name became both curse and crown. She rose from the ashes of disgrace to rule with a strength unmatched by her father's heirs. Under her reign, England entered its golden age. In Elizabeth's triumph, Anne's voice lived again, silenced at the scaffold, yet echoing through the corridors of history. Anne Boleyn's story is not merely one of betrayal and death. It is a story of survival beyond the grave, of a woman whose fall gave rise to a legacy greater than her enemies could imagine. She was cut down, but not erased. In the end, the queen who died with a sword at her neck became immortal in the memory of a nation. And so, 3 days of trials, 1 swing of a blade, and centuries of consequence. Anne Boleyn, executed as a traitor, remembered as a queen, reborn as legend,